Let's see. I've been, it's a strange and kind of wonderful thing in a way. Dave Big Booty just asked about Bush 41. I did my right angle about George Bush Sr., and I like it very much, called Flyboys, and that's should be up by tomorrow morning, if not later on today. So I don't think I'll talk about that today, because I already did. What the heck was I going to say? Oh, I remember. Although this is related to George Bush 41. I'll read something that I knew a little bit about sometimes, and it's getting harder and harder to find things I don't know a little bit about. I don't mean that to sound so arrogant, but my wife will tell you that, I will pick up something to read in the 20 seconds it takes to microwave a pizza. So I read a lot, and the thing that I'm more and more I'm fascinated with, I've read about everything I can find on it in the last I want to say 3 or 4 weeks, because we mentioned it on one of the shows, I want to say a month ago or somewhere in that neighborhood. And that's the Battle of Leyte Gulf. I've been just so just absolutely, I'm reading everything there is on it. And for those of you not familiar with it, it was the largest naval engagement of World War II, largest naval engagement of the modern era, and perhaps the largest naval engagement of all time. Although I want to say Salamis or one of those others, Lepanto, may have had more people involved. But Leyte Gulf was a 2-day running battle that basically had 4 different scenes, and scene 2 and scene 4. Battle of Surigao Straits, and scene 4, which is a battle off Samar, or Samar, somebody will tell me. And Dave Big Booty parenthetically mentions that George Bush got shot down on off an island named Chichijima, where they were eating people, and that's exactly right. And I tell that story a little bit in the right angle, although I think I might have got the actual number of enlisted men wrong by 1 or 2. The Japanese on Chichijima were eating people. They were basically serving up their liver to the officers. And the part that I read today after I recorded the show, and I forgot to mention, was that in some cases the officers ate them just out of sheer Bushido insanity, and some of the men ate them because they were so hungry. And I know this is absolutely horrifying, just absolutely horrifying, but to give you an idea of what George Bush evaded by swimming out to sea instead of to the shore, there's pretty good evidence that for a couple of U.S. flyers, they would eat arms and legs, but they would amputate them to keep the limbs fresh. So they'd come in, hack off an arm, chow down, wait a couple days, come get the other arm. That is beyond... I think that might be beyond anything I've ever read. But George Bush narrowly missed becoming number 8 or 9 of the 6 or 7 guys that were down there. So that aspect of his life I thought needed to be told, and we recorded it right as there was the viewing going on in the Capitol Rotunda, I think, and the ceremony. And it takes that is a world away. So it's so much. When I say a world away, I don't mean just on the other side of the planet. It's on the other side of reality. To even consider these things. He signed up as a pilot when he was 18 years old on his birthday. He was the youngest naval aviator in the Navy for a time, and prior to President Bush passing away last week, I'd been just so deep into the whole Leyte Gulf thing, and I think the thing that has got me so hooked about it was something that I'd never really considered before, and that was two things. Number one, the magnitude of the guys that we lost, and secondly, up until really diving into this, based on a book that Steve Green recommended called "The Fleet at Flood Tide," which was about final phase of the war from Saipan to the surrender. And then I read Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, which is an astonishingly great book about Taffy 3 and Battle off Samar. And then I read The Battle of Surigao Strait, and so on and so on and so on. But the thing that I had not considered at all, really, and I knew a fair bit about warfare and history of warfare, but I'd never really fully understood just how horrible naval combat is, because it always looks so what's the word I'm looking for? The scale is too big. I mean, you're looking across 3 miles of ocean and you see a kamikaze plane hit an aircraft carrier, and an aircraft carrier is an enormous structure, and the fact that there's a couple thousand people on board there is a mathematical thing, but you don't get to really understand it. But once you take it down to the level of a destroyer or a destroyer escort, where everybody knows everybody's name, and it's just absolutely astonishing. There are so many details about this, and obviously I could do 10 hours on this. But in the Battle of Surigao Strait, the night prior to the Battle of off Samar with Taffy 3, 2 independent Japanese fleets sailed up Surigao Strait in darkness, were met by American PT boats, American destroyers, American cruisers, and even American battleships. And they lost, I want to say they took 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, a couple light cruisers, and maybe 5 or 6 destroyers in, and 1 destroyer came back. It was an incredibly brave action on the part of the commander, who, I want to say Nishimura, who basically was offered up as bait, as a distraction, pull forces down to the south away from the Gulf, so that Admiral Kurita and his... the idea behind the Japanese plan to defend the Philippines was here's the island of Leyte, and we're going to make a landing on Leyte. And then up at the top, Admiral Ozawa takes 1 Japanese fleet carrier and 2 or 3 light carriers, and comes, because this whole thing is being covered by 7th Fleet is doing the landing, and 3rd Fleet is Admiral Halsey's strike force, which is an insanely powerful group of aircraft carriers, 9 or 10 aircraft carriers, battleships, everything. And he's covering the Leyte landings, but 7th Fleet is actually doing the shore bombardment with their escort carriers and so on. So far so good. So the Japanese decide what they're going to do is they're going to send Admiral Ozawa down with the Japanese aircraft carriers, because they know that Halsey is so aggressive and so temperamental that when he sees aircraft carriers, there's no way on earth he's going to leave them there. So sure enough, this northern diversion works. Halsey peels his entire 3rd Fleet off, goes chasing after Ozawa, leaves Leyte Gulf, and just prior to this, or simultaneous to this, the Japanese send another force down across the bottom, which comes right up Surigao Straits and is just a sacrificial lamb. It just walks into the slaughter. But that pulls forces south, and Halsey's going north, and American battleships are going south, and Leyte Gulf is wide open. And then on the morning of the next day, along comes the actual serious punch, which is Admiral Kurita's center force. And everybody who wasn't Bill Halsey thought that Bill Halsey was blocking the north end of this landing, but he had gone off on an errand. And so there was nothing left to defend against the most powerful surface force the Japanese ever put together, certainly arguably the most powerful one in history, super battleships Yamato and Musashi, both part of this mission. And what what had especially galled me in reading the history was that Halsey didn't know, and in fact we didn't know, that by the time that Ozawa was dangling those aircraft carriers, the Japanese aircraft carriers, as bait, they were essentially useless. We had done so much damage to their air groups, their airplanes, all of their trained pilots. The three carriers had something like 40 airplanes between them, and they were simply, Japan was out of naval aviation by this point. There was nothing to lose by losing those carriers because they didn't have any airplanes that they could fly off of them. Anyway. So you end up with this whole thing where you have these very fragile, very, very inexpensive and easy to build escort carriers, jeep carriers. I talked about this a little bit last time, that are not designed to enter combat under any circumstances. They don't have the watertight compartments. Their skin is much thinner and brittle, steel and all the rest of it. And then you've got, in the northernmost of these groups, the ones closest to the incoming Japanese clenched steel fist, you've got 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. 3 destroyers, Hull, Huick, and the Johnston. And then 4 destroyer escorts, which are even smaller than them, the 5 destroyers. The 3 destroyers had 5 5-inch gun turrets. The destroyer escorts had 2. And 3 torpedoes on the escorts, as opposed to, I want to say, 10 on the Fletcher-class destroyers. So anyway, you've got these tiny little surface ships, 6 of them. 3 of them are tiny little destroyers, and 4 of them are half that powerful, and they are destroyer escorts. And they basically pick up radar in the north and hear some anti-aircraft fire, or see some anti-aircraft fire. And right around 6:30 in the morning, 7:30 in the morning on the 25th of October, 1944, they look to the north and they can see these tall masts, the pagoda masts. The Japanese built their surface ships with very, very, very tall structures because they optically sighted their gunnery, and the higher you are above the horizon, the further you can see. And Yamato, for example, had guns that could fire to 25, 26 miles, which is over the horizon. So these guys in these tiny little escort carriers and these tiny, tiny, tiny little destroyers and destroyer escorts are looking to the north, and through binoculars they can see the tops of these towers. They can't even see the hulls yet, but they start to see these, these tower structures just kind of coming up over the horizon. And next thing you know, they're being run down by an astonishingly powerful fleet. There's no sign of Halsey. There's no sign of the defense. The battleships are too far to the south. They've got these hollow-skinned jeep carriers, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. And this is where the battle becomes, just for me, just becomes sublime. I mean, I've always been an enormous student of these great moments in history, and the Battle of Britain and Rorke's Drift and the stand on a little round top and all of it. But I don't think I can find a story as quite as amazing as this one in the Battle off Samar. So the 6 escort carriers, they're aircraft carriers, they're small ones, about a third the complement of a major fleet carrier. They start running. They want to run south to get away from the Japanese, but they also have to go east into the wind because they got to launch their airplanes. Commander, the admiral in charge of Taffy 3, Sprague, says, I want you to make smoke to cover us up. It might buy us another 10 or 15 minutes. None of these guys expected to be alive a half an hour later. They all thought they'd be either dead or swimming in half an hour, because this Japanese force coming down from the north is not only unbelievably powerful, but it's also very, very fast. It's a 30-knot fleet, and the escort carriers could do 16 knots. So they start running, and the admiral orders the destroyers to start making smoke. So they make smoke, which actually does quite a bit to help the carriers. But the problem with making smoke is, if you're one of the guys making smoke, and the wind is moving the way it was moving, then what you're doing is the smoke that is protecting the aircraft carriers behind you is also making you stand out directly, because you're now in front of this line of smoke. So this is where it becomes just, I mean, it really becomes almost unbelievable. Heermann was the other destroyer, Hoke and Heermann. So there were basically 4 ships in this conflict, and 2 of them get a lot of attention, and the 2 that don't get as much attention are the USS Hoke and USS Heermann. And understandably so, from a storytelling point of view, it would really, really suck to be one of the crew members of these and see all the glory going to the other 2 places. It's certainly they were all for all crews on all the Taffy 3 crews were incredibly brave. But basically, what happens is, without orders, USS Johnson, captained by Everett Evans, decides that he and his little destroyer, with its 5-inch diameter guns, he just turns around. The whole group is fleeing south, and USS Johnson just turns around and sails straight into the Japanese invasion force and starts opening fire. And for 2 hours, USS Johnston, I said Johnson, it's Johnston, USS Johnston is fighting the most powerful battleships ever created. To give you an idea of the forces that he was up against, the Yamato, the super Japanese battleship, which was one of, I want to say, 3 battleships that were 3 or 4 in that surface group, the Yamato weighed more. The total displacement weight of the Yamato was greater than all of Taffy 3, including the aircraft carriers. So this one battleship weighed more than the 6 aircraft carriers and the escort vehicles. Just one of the turrets on Yamato weighed more than the Johnston did. And this guy just sailed into hell. I mean, he just sailed into hell. And this was the part I mentioned at the very beginning. Your uncle, what is it? Teddyman? Sorry. Your uncle was on USS Heermann, very proud to make it through this battle. I'm going to imagine that your uncle's not with us anymore. I hope he survived the battle. And I just want to tell you on behalf of me, if he has any surviving relatives other than yourself, you tell him I'm unbelievably proud to belong to the same country as him. Heermann, Hoke, Johnston, and Roberts. So off goes Evans, sailing into the teeth of this thing, opening fire, dodging these incoming shells, and surrealistically enough, all of the Japanese battleships had die markers on their shells, because if you got 15 guys shooting at one target, or even 4 big guys, let's say, each one of the ships is trying to correct its gunnery by checking where the last salvo lands. If the last salvo runs short, you want to elevate the guns and push the next salvo further out. And so each one of these ships had different colored dye. And so every time one of these big battleship shells put up a column of water 15 stories high, and it'd be either green or blue or red, just these rainbow splashes of water all around Johnston. Interestingly enough, the skipper was doing something that it's almost like one of these stories where you just can't believe nobody figured it out. But basically, what he was doing was he was chasing the splashes. So if he was, the Musashi was the other super battleship along with Yamato. Musashi was sunk the day before in battle number 1 of the 4 battles of Leyte Gulf. And so what he would do, he had a destroyer which is small and fast. Those were its only defenses because the armor would stop nothing. And he would chase the splashes, so whenever he'd see rounds hitting the water, he would steer directly for that spot, because they always, this is the part that's so interesting and so strange. Everybody's mentioning World of Warships. I've seen it, I haven't played it, I've seen numbers, and I've watched hours of gameplay of World of Warships, and I think it's great, but that was way before I heard this story. I'm sure I'll get around to that eventually. So what he would do is whenever these big, enormous splashes would come up in the water, he would steer directly to that spot, because he knew that since they missed, they were going to adjust their aim. And so by going to where the lightning had just struck, he had a very good chance of not getting struck again. Which is, in other words, if the gunners on board the ships had not changed anything, if they'd realized what he was doing, hadn't changed anything except compensated for their own motion, shot one round and then waited till he moved to that shot another round, it would have been all over. So Johnson is making this run in and miraculously doesn't get hit for a while, launches its torpedoes, scores a hit on one of the cruisers, as I recall, comes around and starts getting smashed. He's retiring out of the battle. He's taken all of these hits. And then Sprague orders the rest of the escort to go and make a torpedo run. First the destroyers, then the destroyer escorts against the incoming Japanese column, trying to slow them down a little bit. So as Johnson is coming back out of the battle, Captain Evans has already had part of his left hand shot off. It's just missing. It's gone. And he's retiring out of the battle with a lot of holes in his ship. And when the order comes to go make the torpedo attack, the USS Johnston had already made the torpedo attack and scored some hits. And in order to get the torpedoes in, you have to get in under 10,000 yards and probably better to 7,000 yards. Yamato can reach to 25,000 yards or more. So you just had to go in and just take all the shell fire and pray to God they didn't hit you, because one big shell would probably do it. And all the secondary batteries and the destroyers and everything. He's just going in there, sliding his way through there, gets his torpedoes off, comes out. He's taking hits everywhere. Engine's gone. He's got half the speed, which is survival for the destroyer. He's had half his hand blown off. The bridge has been hit. He's retiring out of battle, and the order comes for the other 5 escorts to make a torpedo attack. And as these other destroyers, the Heermann and the Holt, and the destroyer escorts, as they start doing the same thing that Johnson had just done, which is these little tiny tin cans with no armor at all, racing into the teeth of this unbelievably powerful surface force. As Johnson is coming out of the fight, he sees the other destroyers going in, and he doesn't have any torpedoes. And he's lost an engine, and he's taken heavy, heavy casualties. And Evans says to the rest of the crew, he says, we're going to go in with them. We can draw some fire. Maybe they'll fire at us instead of firing at the guys with the torpedoes. At the very least, we can put some of these rounds on these things. Now, you got to understand that the guns on the Johnston and on the destroyer escorts like the Roberts, those guns could never penetrate the hull of a battleship. There was zero chance that those rounds could go through the armor. They were far too small. They just literally bounce off the hull. But they could put rounds up into the superstructure and the bridge and cause some fires and suppress the gunners and all the rest of it. And the torpedoes could actually sink a big ship if you put enough into them. I want to say Musashi took something like 18 torpedoes and 20 bomb hits, something on that nature. Both Musashi and Yamato it's incredible what it took to sink those guys. So here comes Johnston out of the fight. The other guys are going into the fight. Johnston basically says, we've just had our butt mauled. We don't have any ship-killing weapons anymore. We're going to now turn around. We're going to go in the rest of these guys. We're going to go in again to help them with the odds. And somewhere in this order, which I'm a little more familiar with, but I'm not going to bore you with the details of, a destroyer escort, which is, instead of 5 5-inch guns, has 2 5-inch guns, is essentially the size of a decent commercial fishing boat, really. The captain on there was some confusion about this. I thought it was Evans, but it turns out it was Robert Copeland, I think, Bob Copeland, on the captain of the Samuel B. Roberts, which was the smallest fighting ship in the Navy. The smallest fighting ship in the Navy is going up against the largest battleship ever built, plus 2 other battleships, plus 4 or 5 cruisers, plus 10 destroyers. Every single one of them bigger than she was. And the captain on the Copeland issues a statement to his crew, and he says, we are about to go into battle against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. That'll get your attention. So this tiny little thing is not even a tin can. It's half a tin can. This destroyer escort goes sailing right into the middle of this Japanese column. And the guns are blasting. They're just getting off something like 400 rounds in half an hour. It's unbelievable. And And they just went in there, and they got off their torpedoes, and they just kept hitting the Japanese ships. They kept hitting them. The rounds were essentially bouncing off, but they were putting out so much fire. The Johnston, especially, and the Roberts, were putting out such an incredible volume of fire. Even though they were shooting cap guns at these tanks, they were shooting so much and so accurately that the Japanese really began to wonder what the hell's going on. The Japanese thought they were cruisers. They didn't know they were destroyers or destroyer escorts. Thought they were cruisers. They thought the escort carriers were fleet carriers. They thought we were much more powerful than we were. And because these guys went at them as hard as they did, they started to have some second thoughts. The Japanese send some destroyers out to put some torpedoes into the escort carriers, but the Roberts just runs right at them and forces them to shoot early, so the torpedoes miss. And sure enough, the Roberts get shot to hell and sunk. So the Hoke sunk whole, the Roberts sunk, the Johnston sunk. One of the escort carriers was sunk by Japanese gunfire, Gambier Bay. The St. Lo, a second one of the escort carriers, was destroyed at the last minute by the first genuine kamikaze attack, intentional kamikaze attack. But just when the Japanese had it won, because they simply, the shells were just literally bouncing off of them. Once the Japanese had it won, the tenacity of the destroyer fight and the tenacity of the aviators, and this is the other part of the story I just wanted to tell, just to give you an idea of what George Bush wasn't in this battle particularly, but this is what life was like for these young men. When the Japanese were sighted, you had 6 escort carriers, which instead of having maybe 90 planes on them, had maybe 30. And all of these planes were largely out of ammunition because they'd been bombarding the shore during the landing for the last 3 days. And since the Japanese ships are on the horizon closing fast, they just launched whatever planes they had with whatever ammunition they had. Now, we had a very effective dive bomber, the Dauntless, and we had an extraordinarily good naval bomber called the Avenger. And that's what George Bush flew, was an Avenger. The Avenger was a torpedo airplane, but could also carry bombs and depth charges. And as these guys are waking up to the fact that their lives are probably going to be over in 15 or 20 minutes, they just launch everything they can, mostly because they're so sure that the carriers are going to be sunk by gunfire, that they wanted to at least get the planes off. And so the second part of this story is these airmen launching strike after strike after strike, individually, not coordinated in any way, going against the most ferocious anti-aircraft fire that maybe has ever existed. The Yamato alone could put up a just incredible curtain of anti-aircraft fire. And the thing about this that was so amazing was many of the Avengers just plain had no weapons on them. They either had 250-pound or 100-pound bombs, which is like throwing it's like throwing a wad of gum at the Yamato. So what these American pilots would do is they would come in, and to launch a torpedo attack, you have to do everything you don't want to do, which means you have to fly low, straight as an arrow, and slow. So these Avenger pilots would start to make runs on the Japanese column, and these guys are basically just sitting ducks. They're just coming in a straight line like they would on a torpedo run, and as they get closer, they open their bomb bay doors, torpedo doors, and all of the anti-aircraft fire is directed to these guys, and the Japanese ships are turning away and maneuvering, and the guy gets close enough to launch his torpedoes, and it turns out he doesn't drop any torpedoes because he doesn't have any torpedoes. He just they just went in there, and again and again and again, without weapons, went in there through the teeth of that anti-aircraft fire and bluffed them, made them turn away, because the Japanese couldn't be sure that they didn't have any weapons. There are stories of guys strafing these battleships and cruisers. One guy made something like 15 or 20 passes before he ran out of ammunition. Then he flew back to an island, landed. One of these pilots landed at an Army base that was just being set up, Army Air Force Base, and he said, "We are under attack out there. We need all the bombs and and all the fuel that you've got." And this Army major said, "I can't do that. I've got a flight of P-38 Lightnings coming in 3 days, and this bomb loads and the fuels for those airplanes. I can't give it to you." And this Navy pilot drew his revolver and pointed it at the Army officer and said, "You're going to put those bombs on this airplane right now, or else something bad's going to happen." And so they rearmed and just went out there and just kept hitting him and hitting him and hitting him and hitting him. And finally, Kurita, who was in charge of this unbelievably powerful force, simply lost his nerve. But he didn't lose his nerve because he just chickened out. He lost his nerve because the attack against his forces was so intense and so severe that he didn't think he'd survive to get to the landing sites in Leyte. When, after the battle was over, certainly the Americans knew from the moment they saw the first blip on the radar that this fleet that Kurita had, this Japanese fleet, could not be stopped by anything. It would just, if it sailed directly south, there's nothing that could have stopped it. Put a couple torpedoes into the Yamato, it doesn't even slow down, doesn't even feel it. They could have gone right into the middle of Leyte Gulf. They could have sank all of the transports, could have destroyed the 6 carriers in Taffy 3, another 6 carriers in the center group, another 6 carriers in the southern group, all part of that same unit. Plus their escorts could have gone right through them like a bull in a china shop. But the intensity of the attack on the Japanese fleet was so severe that he basically, just when he had the battle won, he just said, we're turning around. We're not going to get through this. It's just, the fire's too intense. To give you some idea of this, I mean, that's the mega story, and you think, oh, what heroes? But certainly they were, but in order to appreciate what this consisted of, this kind of courage consisted of, you have to have some idea of what this kind of fighting was like. One of the destroyers, one of the reasons that the Americans survived as long as they did was that the Japanese were using armor-piercing shells designed to go through the thick armor of battleships and cruisers. But the armor on the American destroyers and the escort carriers, the armor was so thin that was actually their saving grace. Scores, if not hundreds, of rounds shot right through the ship. The shell would come in, punch a hole like this, punch a hole on the other side, and go out without exploding. And if they had been using high explosive ammunition instead of armor piercing, which would have been the right ammunition if they were going against cruisers and battleships, then it would have been over way early. So time and time again, Johnston and Hoke and Heerman and Roberts are just getting shot right through, like a bullet round going through a tin can, just right through the other side. But to give you some idea of what this kind of battle does, I'm trying to think of a couple of examples that really stuck out in my mind, and a couple of them are this. One of these shells exploded in a sick bay on one of these vessels. And when the teams went down there afterwards to see if there were any survivors, all they found were mattresses that were up against the bulkheads, and the mattresses had little shreds of cloth on it where the sailors had been blown through the mattress. The force of the explosion had blown their bodies through the mattress, and little shreds of their uniform were sticking to the springs. Just body parts everywhere, blood everywhere. Guys coming out from the engine room on one of these vessels where the steam that runs the ship's turbines as well as powers a lot of the other systems, that steam gets hit. It's under enormous pressure. It's 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And they said there were stories of guys coming out of the engine room of either the Johnson or the Roberts, and these guys would climb out of this engine room, and they said they were absolutely white. They were just snowy white. And the reason they were snowy white was because they'd just been boiled like shrimp. Their skin had been boiled off, and they were just completely white, and they just sat down on the deck and fortunately were dead within 2 or 3 minutes. There was a guy, I should know, I'm pretty sure he was on the Johnston, named, I forget his first name, but he's named Carr. I believe he won the Medal of Honor, was awarded the Medal of Honor. The captain of the Copeland was, and so was Evans, as I believe the captain of the Johnston, but there was one of these guns, I think it was on the Johnston, one of these 5-inch turrets, and they're all pretty much self-contained. Once the targeting systems are knocked out, each one of the turrets fire independently. And I want to say it was gun number 4 on Johnston, but I may be wrong about that. But in any event, this particular turret, and again, I might be wrong about the numbers, but they're close. This particular turret had 225 rounds of ammunition, and they fired 224 of them. When the turret exploded, the gun exploded because the device that would blow the hot gases out of the barrel was disabled. So they're putting rounds into a barrel. The barrel's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And when they're just got one round's in the chamber and they got the last round ready to go, the gun explodes and explodes inside this tiny turret, basically just vaporizes most of the guys. And when they sent a team down there to find out this gun crew that fired 224 of its total 225 shells, they got in there and they found this guy, Seaman Carr, and he was standing up against the side of the turret, and the force of the explosion had ripped a hole in him from his neck all the way down to his groin. He was just opened up. And above his head, he's still alive. Above his head, he's holding a 55-pound 5-inch shell. He's holding it up like this. His entrails are falling out of his body because he's sliced open. And he is holding a shell over his head, the last round, the last one, and he's begging the people that came in to try and rescue him to help him load the gun, to put that final round into the gun. The gun was gone. The gun was useless. They finally had to take the shell away from him and tell him they were going to fire it, and 5 minutes later he was dead. But these kind of stories, and the guys going again and again and again with no weapons, and just getting shot at like that, and then realizing you're getting shot at. I can't even shoot back. I'm not going in on this run so that I can bomb this thing or torpedo it. After a while, I'm not even going in so I can strafe it. I'm simply going in on the hope that it's going to think I have some ammunition and turn away. And that's exactly what happened. The Japanese ships had to keep turning to avoid bomb strikes or torpedo strikes that really didn't come. And the torpedo spreads that the Johnston and the Copeland put out made them turn. And every time they turned away, gave the carriers a little bit more time to get out of there. You hear stories like this, and you think that that these people, not even of the same species, I suppose I should say we're not of the same species, that there's something so unbelievably monumental about it. And the stories about guys like Mr. Carr and all of these others, stories of there was one guy, I think he was on the Gambier Bay on the escort carrier. When the thing got hit, all this flaming gasoline goes down into the hangar deck, and this guy had to crawl underneath the fuselage of airplanes. He's already badly burned and wounded. To crawl underneath, already been hit in the abdomen too, something had fallen on him. Had to crawl underneath these burning airplanes and basically seal off the gasoline supply. And what's remarkable about that, other than its own remarkability, is what he'd done the exact same thing just a few hours earlier. He went back in and did it again, I don't, the temptation is to say that we're just not made out of the same stuff as them. But that's just not true. We have people like this right now. I've met them. I've met many of them who are made of the same stuff. And my respect and admiration for them is boundless. And I can't get enough of the details of this because I feel like I owe them that. And I feel like I owe them, at the very least, a chance to tell a few thousand of you people about this story. In the 70s, they made a movie called Tora, Tora, Tora about the attack on Pearl Harbor, which I saw when I was, it was 73, 74, 75, somewhere in there. So I was probably 15, 16 years old. And that was one where the bad guys win. And then they made, a couple years later, they made a movie called Midway. And Midway was amazing. I've talked about Midway several times. I knew a fair amount about Midway, knew next to nothing about the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and very, very little about the Battle of Samar Island. And it just makes me wonder why these stories haven't been told. Natasha and I have seen a couple of movies this year. We saw Nutcracker because I thought it was going to be about, the Nutcracker. And it had nothing to do with the Nutcracker. It was a $100 million horrendous ripoff. And every time we come out of a movie like that, my beautiful wife says, what could have been done with that money? And I think, yeah. When you can say this is a true story, that matters. It really matters. And these names should be on everybody's lips. I mean, we really everybody should know about Ernest Evans. I might have said Everett Evans. Ernest Evans, captain of the Johnston. Everybody should know about Evans. They should know about his crew. They should know about what they did. When the Johnston sank, prior to its sinking, the bridge had been hit and the steering had been knocked out. And so the captain of the ship went back to the very back to the fantail and opened a hatch. And down below, since the hydraulic steering was out, he had to steer his ship. Now, you remember, he's under constant fire by these Japanese heavy ships, and if he goes on a straight line, he's dead. So the only way they could turn the ship was to manually turn the rudder, which involved two strong men turning this enormous wheel, which was normally driven by hydraulics. And they said the strongest men in the fleet could do this for maybe 10 minutes. And he's screaming left rudder, right rudder, left rudder, screaming down. These men are just hauling on this thing, getting this thing to turn. Bought him 2 hours for Johnston, 2 hours for the USS Johnston. And saved the entire carrier fleet, saved all of their escorts, probably saved the Leyte transports, and may have saved the landing. If those transports had been destroyed, and if the Japanese Navy had shelled our units ashore, which were right on the beach, then the Philippines invasion would have been a catastrophe, and the war would have gone on for 2 more years. But when you think about all the money that's spent on making these really, really pretty terrible movies, in the days, one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by all this stuff, by the computer graphics stuff, is because we are now 2 years away, probably at the most, from me being able to tell this story in here. Right? There. That space. That's how much room I need to be able to tell the story of Taffy 3 in a year or two. I need a budget, but I don't need a $50 million budget. I need a $300,000 budget. Because computer graphics now are so good that they're certainly better than the models. Anybody who's seen the kind of computer graphics I'm talking about, is it Not 47 Yet, says Letters from Iwo Jima and Flags of Our Father. Quite good. They're excellent movies. They're directed by Clint Eastwood, who has been my unbelievable privilege to have gotten to know, and who's complimented me on the work I do, which I'll never, ever, ever, ever get used to. But my point is this. Here's what I would like to do. I've got this series of movies telling the story of America in space and so on. And it makes me want to jump ahead in that story arc 10 years into the future and retell this entire story using science fiction assets. Because to tell the heart of the story, what you need to do is you need to see how big these ships are on the enemy fleet and how small the destroyer and destroyer escorts are. And to do it in computer graphics, if you've seen Flags of Our Father or Letters from Iwo Jima, which I think is actually a better movie, the computer graphics, and the computer graphics in the Pacific as well, for that matter, but for those two movies, those two Clint Eastwood movies, the computer graphics of the fleet, of the attack, of the landing boats going ashore, is as good as it's going to look. I mean, it's much, much, much better than models or some of these, recreations that they use with the wrong equipment and stuff. It's absolutely fantastic. And that requires a person with an eye and who knows how to tell a story. It requires some computing stations. You render the thing online in these render farms, and for a couple $100,000 with the quality of the computer graphics, it would not look like a computer graphics movie. I think you could probably do it in a year with motion capture on the face and the body, which can be done in this room. And I think within a year you would be able to do it with people that were so close to being realistic that essentially you would not be able to tell. Certainly among the young people who need to see these things and hear these stories, who've grown up with game graphics that have just been getting better and better and better every year and started out just simply unbelievably terrible, but get better and better and better, certainly of the quality that they would be able to accept without batting an eyelid. And I'd love to tell that story. First of all, I'd love to tell it in the Star Citizen universe, which will cost a few tens of thousands of dollars, I would say. But once the factory gets set up here, and we have the beginning of a staff and a team here, then you could do it realistically. Some of the water effects, even Titanic. I mean, Titanic is 10 years old now. And 10 years in computer graphics it's a century. But even then, the water and the ship were just very, very good. And they're much better now. So it's strangely enough, because Dave Big Booty says he'd rather see Big Bat Problems first. I'd like to see Big Bat Problems first, too. It's a live-action movie I've had and talked about before. But strangely enough, one of the things that has hit me so strongly over the last year or so is that I can make a photorealistic version of the battle off Samar, the biggest naval engagement in history, for less money than I could make a low-budget science fiction horror film about a bunch of people driving down the freeway and killing aliens. Because of the box, because of the computer, and the cost of the graphics. And did I say? Thank you very much, Babyface Nelson. I said Titanic is 10 years old. It's 20 years old. 20. Sorry about that, Dave Big Booty, other guys, and Witty Fool. 20 years old. And it looked okay then. So what I'd like to do is I could tell that story in the Star Citizen universe for very little money, and then for a little more money, I could do a feature-length film. How many speaking roles are there in this? 10, maybe? It would just be so good, and I mean to do it. I really do. It doesn't seem to me to be a coincidence that that this power of storytelling is starting to fall into my hands just at the point in my life where I actually know what I could do with it. Not only would I love to do the story of Taffy 3, I will do the story of Taffy 3. One way or another, I expect I'll do it as science fiction first, and then if not, I will tell this story, and I'll tell it right. And the destroyer escort, this Samuel B. Roberts, the Sammy B, got nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship because it went into the teeth of a Japanese surface fleet composed of battleships, and this tiny little destroyer escort went in there and fought like a battleship for an hour and a half. When this Roberts was heading in on its final pass, it passed the Johnston, which I think at this point was dead in the water, burning, completely smashed, not recognizable. It's just a burning hunk of metal in the water. And the crew on the Samuel Johnson is heading in on another attack run, and the crew on the Roberts is heading in for another attack run. And USS Johnston is dead in the water, just getting hit by everything. Every Japanese ship kept firing at it just out of sheer frustration, just taking hits all the time, people getting blown to pieces. One guy's friend who's the doctor, he sees him helping with the wounded. He says there's more wounded inside. His friend is heading to the back of the ship. He sees the doctor go inside a hatch, and the second he gets inside the hatch, a round impacts right there and just vaporizes everything in there. So again and again and again, you've got these things. But as the Roberts was going into the fight, the Johnson was dead in the water, and they passed him. And the two captains, who I think are two of the most remarkable men that we've ever had produced in this country, Copeland and Evans. When the Roberts was heading in to make another attack on the Japanese, he looked over and he saw the wreckage of the Johnston. And he could see Captain Evans, his counterpart, on the fantail, his left hand all bandaged up and covered in blood. And as they went in, Evans just looked up at him, and he didn't salute him or anything. He just looked at him and waved at him, and that's the last they saw of him. Johnston sank, and Evans was seen in the water. He got off the ship, but he was never seen again. And the most horrible part of this whole story is that these unbelievably brave men on these battleships, on these American destroyers, were in the water for 2 days, and another 100 at least of them died of either delirium or of their wounds. Some of these guys are horribly burned or horribly wounded. They're in the water. They're expecting to get rescued. Not a mystery where they were. Everybody knew what was going on, but they just missed them on the coordinates. They were looking in the wrong place. These guys are on rafts for 2 days. After 2 days, they said that is much like the Indianapolis, which happened a few months later. You got these guys in the water, 60 guys around not even a raft, just some floating cargo nets and wreckage and stuff. And they say that, what would happen is during the night, it'd be very quiet, and then off on one corner of this circle, you'd hear this yell and then this very, very high-pitched screaming and thrashing around, and then it got quiet again. And these sharks were just taking people, just taking them. And 2 days and 2 nights of that they had to put up with. As just before they got rescued, their thirst and their delirium was so great that a large number of sailors, something 10 or 20 of them or something, asked for permission to dive down, take off their life jackets, dive down, because they knew that the Johnson was just a few feet underneath them, and all they had to do was just dive down, get to the ship, and they knew where there was a supply of fresh water. So they asked permission to quickly go down there and get to the fresh water, and they'd be right back with it. And a number of sailors were convinced that there was a little mini lake of fresh water, like just a few feet underneath the salt water, and any number of these guys in the days or the nights slipped off their life jackets and just dove underwater to get to the fresh water that was just down there, just below the surface, never seen again. And, my feeling is if I didn't have to go through that, and I didn't because they did, then my purpose here is to make sure that they're not forgotten, that they don't disappear. and are only known to people who are willing to do the digging necessary to find out stories that should be front page news. These guys' birthdays should be national holidays. You know, there shouldn't be a high school kid in America that couldn't tell you the story I just told you with the same degree of detail, and you know, it's a wonderful job, and somebody's got to do it. So, yeah. Somebody's asking me some Star Citizen questions, and just to give you, since it's a very specific question and a very specific answer, I'll spend 20 seconds on this. If I would do it in Star Citizen, I would have the Vandal kingships be the Japanese battleships that have all these other Vandal cruisers and destroyers and so on. Vandals are the race of aliens in the Star Citizen universe. And I would have to play around a little bit with our size ships, but I would use the Kraken as a escort carrier, light carrier, not designed for combat. I would use the Javelin for the destroyers, and I'd use the Idris for the destroyer escorts. I actually thought about going even smaller than that and using like the Hammerhead and the Retaliator, but that's inside football. So anyway, enough of that. So we've got time to do some questions until I get the text from Mr. Scott Ott in about 40 minutes from now. Thank you for putting up with me for that. Had to get that out of my system. And if you really want to do yourself a favor, download or go to a bookstore or go to Amazon and order The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. It's the story of Taffy 3. It'll blow your mind. It's just blow your mind. Okay, let's see what we got. Going to our Facebook page. I was real happy with that show I did on Chinese genetic experimentation. It's so much fun doing this Bill Whittle Now show because I get questions. I have no idea what's coming, and so many of these questions I have no answer for. I have to puzzle it out in real time in front of you guys, which is the fun of it. And I remember time and time again thinking, you know, the nice thing about having a value set is that it kind of teaches you how to live, you know? I mean, having a code to live by is useful in that it provides you a code to live by. And it really does work. I mean, if you understand these fundamental principles, and they're not difficult to understand, you know, you can be asked almost any question and be able to find an answer that is both fair and just and doesn't suck. All right, Stratosphere launch questions, as many as we can before Scotty comes.